The winter came to Ravensburg that year, the way a creditor comes to a failing man, quietly at first, and then all at once, and it did not knock. It slid beneath the warped doors of the Faulkner house, and settled in the corners the fires could no longer reach, and it made itself at home in the empty rooms where the furniture had been sold, and it breathed its cold breath upon the last unsold portraits, until the painted ancestors seemed to shiver in their gilt frames. There had been a time, so the old servants said, when the Faulkner name meant something in that corner of the Austrian valleys, when the house had blazed with candlelight, and the long tables had groaned with roasted things, and the cellars had been full, and the daughters had worn silk. That time was gone. It had gone the way of the horses, sold one by one, and the way of the good land, mortgaged parcel by parcel, and the way of the baron's courage, which had leaked out of him drop by drop, until what remained was a fading man in a fading coat, who spent his evenings staring into a grate that held more ash than fire. And in the middle of that slow ruin, unbowed and unremarked, moved a young woman in a plain grey dress. Annalisa Faulkner didn't cry. She had learned early that tears were a coin, and that a woman with nothing must not spend the little she has, and so she kept her grief locked away where no one could see it. Spend her. She rose before the light, and she mended what could be mended, and she stretched the flower, and she read to her father when his eyes grew tired, and she wore that grey wool dress until it had gone soft and thin as memory, because it was the only one that had not been sold. She was 21, and she had never worn silk in her life that she could remember, and she had made a kind of peace with being unseen. To be useful was one thing, to be noticed was another, and she had decided long ago that she required only the first. So she was not surprised, only tired. On the grey morning the letter came, bearing the black wax seal of the house of von Eichendorff, and her father's hands shook as he broke it, and his ruined face lifted with a terrible, desperate hope that frightened her more than any despair had. The Duke, he told her, the young Duke Constantin von Eichendorff, master of the great Schloss beyond the mountains, was to choose a wife. His grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, had summoned every eligible daughter of every old family within 3 days' ride to a great gathering, and among those names, dredged up from the bottom of the register, half forgotten, was the name of Faulkner. It was, the Baron whispered, their salvation. It was, Annalisa thought, standing at the frost-webbed window, with the letter cold in her hand, a form of theft dressed up as fortune, the theft of a young woman's future to pay an old man's debts. But she looked at his trembling hope, and she looked at the empty grate, and she folded the letter, and she said only, in her plain and level voice, that she would go. She did not say she would be chosen. She was not a fool. She had a mirror, and she had seen the daughters of richer houses, and she knew that a duke did not stoop to gather up the plain grey remnants of a bankrupt line. But she would go, and she would stand where she was told to stand, and she would give her father these few weeks of hope, and then she would come home to the cold and the mending, and life would resume its narrow course. That night she packed her single small trunk by the light of a single candle, and into it she folded the grey dress, washed and pressed, and one other, older still, and her mother's small worn Bible, and a comb, and nothing else worth naming, and she blew out the candle and lay in the dark and listened to the winter making itself at home in the walls of the only home she had ever known. She did not weep. She counted her breaths instead, slow and even, the way she always did, and somewhere past midnight she slept, and she dreamed of nothing, and in the morning the carriage the Duke had sent stood at the broken gate, black and gleaming and impossibly fine, like a raven perched among the ruins, waiting to carry her off to a world that had no place for her. The Schloss von Eichendorff rose out of the mountain mist, like something dreamed by a colder age, all pale stone and black windows, and towers that vanished into the low cloud, and as the carriage climbed the long avenue of bare and frozen limes, Anneliese understood that she had come to a house that did not love the people inside it. She had expected grandeur. She had not expected the chill of it, the way the great courtyard swallowed sound, the way the liveried servants moved like clockwork figures with their eyes fixed on nothing, the way the vast entrance hall echoed her small footsteps back at her, as if to say, "You do not belong here. You do not belong." There were a dozen young women already arrived, and a dozen more came in the days that followed, and they filled the cold rooms with a nervous, glittering, brittle warmth, all of them arranged like flowers for the choosing, all of them watching the doors for the Duke. But the Duke didn't come. He was delayed, the steward said, on business of the estate. He would present himself in due course. The ladies were to make themselves comfortable and to be patient. And so they waited, and while they waited, they measured one another with quick, cruel eyes. And Anneliese, in her plain grey dress, was measured and found beneath notice, and she felt the old familiar invisibility settle over her like a shawl, and she was, to her own surprise, almost grateful for it. For at the centre of that glittering company stood Cosima Strand, a beauty so complete and so aware of itself that it filled a room the way cold fills a house. A young woman with hair like dark honey, and a laugh like breaking crystal, and a gown of deep blue silk that must have cost more than the whole of the Faulkner debt, and Cosima had decided it was plain that the Duke was already hers, and that the gathering was a formality, and that the other women were furniture. She was gracious to those who could serve her, and glacial to those who could not, and when her pale gaze slid across Anneliese, it did not even pause. It registered the grey wool and the mended cuffs and the absence of jewels, and it moved on. And that was the whole of Cosima's acquaintance with the woman who would one day undo her. Anneliese did not mind. She found in that vast and heartless house that she could not bear the drawing-rooms and their perfumed tension, and so on the second morning she slipped away through a servant's door and out into the raw grey air. And she walked, and her walking brought her at last to the stables, which were warm with the breath of horses, and smelled of hay and leather and living things. And there, for the first time since she had come, she felt she could draw a full breath. And there, mucking out a stall in a rough coat with straw in his dark hair and dirt on his hands, was a young man she took to be a stable hand, broad-shouldered and severe of face, who looked up at her with grey eyes that were startlingly, almost coldly intelligent, and who said nothing at all. Most women would have withdrawn. A lady did not converse with the grooms, but Anneliese had spent her life among servants who were kinder to her than her equals, and she saw only a tired man doing hard work in the cold, and so she inclined her head, and she wished him a good morning, plainly and without condescension, as one person greets another, and she asked whether she might sit a while out of the wind. For the house, she said, was colder than the stable, and she thought perhaps he understood what she meant by that, for something flickered behind the grey eyes. He gave her a curt nod. She sat upon an upturned pail, and the great horses shifted and steamed, and the man returned to his work, and for a long while neither of them spoke, and it was the most peaceful hour she had passed in a 12-month. His name, he told her, when at last she asked it, was Rainer, and he was slow to give even that, as though a name were something a man in his position ought not to spend freely. Anneliese did not press him. She came again the next day. and the next, drawn back to the warmth of the stables and the strange restful quiet of the man who did not flatter her, and did not dismiss her, and did not seem to require her to be anything other than what she was. She learned to make herself useful there, as she made herself useful everywhere. She mended a torn bridle with quick, sure fingers while he watched, saying nothing, and she carried water, and she spoke gently to a nervous young mare that had been kicking at its stall, laying her plain, unjewelled hand against its trembling neck until it stilled, and she did not once seem to remember that she was a baron's daughter, and he a groom, and this, though she could not have known it, was the thing that undid him. For Rainer the stable-hand was not Rainer the stable-hand at all. He was Constantin von Eichendorff, Duke of the whole cold estate and every soul in it, and the disguise was a thing he had chosen deliberately, out of a bitterness that ran to the bone. He had watched, in his 24 years, the whole of the world arrange itself around his title and his fortune, had watched women assemble their faces into whatever shape they believed he wished to see, had watched men who despised him bow to his name, and he had grown certain, with the certainty of a man who has never once been loved for himself, that there was no honesty left in his world, that every smile turned toward him was a smile turned toward his money, that he could hire 50 women to adore him, and not one of them would mean a word of it. So when his grandmother had insisted upon the gathering, he had struck a bargain with himself. He would not present himself as the Duke and be lied to by beautiful strangers. He would put on a groom's coat and rub dirt into his hands and become a nobody, and he would watch how these celebrated ladies behaved toward a nobody, for a person's truth, he believed, is shown not in how they treat the powerful, but in how they treat the powerless. And what he had seen in those first days had only hardened him. He had seen Cosima Strand strike a kitchen boy across the face for spilling water on her hem. He had seen ladies who cooed like doves in the drawing-room speak to the maids as though to animals. He had watched, from the shadows of his own stables, the whole rotten performance, and he had very nearly resolved to send them all home and marry no one, and let the name die with him. And then a plain young woman in a grey dress had walked into his stable and wished him good morning, as though he were a man and not a shadow, and had sat upon a pail out of the wind, and had asked him his name, and then troubled to remember it. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself she was clever, that she had somehow guessed, that this was a subtler performance than the others. He set traps for her. He was curt to the edge of rudeness, and she was unoffended. He let fall that the ladies in the house were saying cruel things about the shabby Faulkner girl, and she only smiled a small, tired smile and said that people who had never been cold said many things about those who had. He asked her, one grey afternoon, why she troubled to speak to a groom when there was a duke to be won upstairs, and she looked at him with her steady, honest eyes, and said that she had no expectation of winning any duke, that she had come to give her father a few weeks of hope, and would go home when it was done, and that in the meantime the company of a horse and an honest man was a great deal more restful than the company of ladies. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. He did not answer her, but something in the frozen ground of him had cracked, silently, the way ice cracks in the first thaw, deep down where no eye can see it, and the sound of it travelled all the way to the buried root of him, and he was, for the first time in longer than he could remember, afraid, though he could not yet have said of what. The days that followed sharpened everything, the way frost sharpens the edges of the world. Constantin found excuses to be in the stables when Anneliese came. He arranged the estate's business so that it required him, precisely then, to be mending precisely that harness. and he told himself these were the calculations of a careful man testing a candidate, and did not admit that they were the small, hungry manoeuvres of a lonely one. He learned the shape of her days. He learned that she rose early and helped the housemaids, unasked, because she could not bear to sit idle while others worked. The maids who owed her nothing had begun to love her, and this too he noted. He learned that she read when she thought no one watched, and that she had a quick and unsentimental mind, and that when he spoke to her of the failing tenant farms of the Eastern Valley, careless as though a groom might repeat the servant's talk, she asked him 3 questions so exact and practical that he was silenced, for they were the very questions he himself had lain awake asking. And meanwhile, the great house went on with its cruelties. Cosima Strand had grown impatient with the Duke's absence and vicious with the waiting, and she had chosen Annalisa as the object upon which to sharpen her boredom. For a beautiful woman must always have someone to be beautiful against. She mocked the grey dress at dinner in a voice pitched to carry. She wondered aloud, sweetly, whether the Falconers had come to find a husband or to beg alone. She arranged for Annalisa's place to be set at the very foot of the long table, below the poor relations of the poor relations, and she watched to see whether the plain girl would weep or rage, and was disappointed on both counts, for Annalisa only took her lowly seat with the same level composure she took everything, and ate her small portion, and thanked the servant who filled her glass by name, which no one else at that table ever did. Constantin heard of all of it. He heard of it because he had eyes and ears throughout the house that answered to the Duke, and did not know the groom. And one grey evening, standing unseen in a gallery above the great hall, he heard Cosima herself, thinking she spoke only to her 2 allies, lay out her whole design in a low, laughing voice. She would have the Duke, she said, and once she had him, she would be rid of every reminder of this tedious contest. She would strip the estate of its dreary economies and fill it with the right sort of people. And as for the little grey mouse from the ruined house, she said, she would enjoy watching the creature crawl home to its debtors when the game was done. And she laughed, and the crystal of her laugh rang up into the dark gallery where the Duke stood with his hands going slowly to fists, and he thought of a plain woman on an upturned pail saying that the company of an honest man was restful, and he made in that moment a decision that would stun the whole of his world. But he did not act at once. He was too careful a man, too scarred a man, to trust even his own certainty, and so he set himself one final test. The next morning, in the stable, in his groom's coat, he told Annalisa a lie. He told her he had heard from the steward that the Duke had at last made his choice, that it was to be the beautiful Fräulein Strand, and that the announcement would come within days. He watched her face as he said it, watched for the flicker of thwarted calculation, the swallowed disappointment of a schemer whose scheme has failed. And Annalisa only nodded and was quiet a moment, and then she said, gently, that she hoped the lady would be kind to him and to the horses, because a house takes its temper from the hand that rules it, and that she herself would be glad to go home, for she missed her father, and there was a great deal of mending to be done before the true cold came. And then she rose from her pail, and she laid her hand once upon the neck of the little nervous mare in farewell, and she wished Rayner the groom a good day, and she walked out into the grey morning with her back straight and her step even, having wanted nothing from him, having asked nothing of him, having given him only kindness in a place that had shown her none. And Constantin von Eichendorff stood alone among his horses, with the lie still bitter on his tongue, and understood, at last, and all the way down, that he was in love. The announcement, when it came, did not come as anyone had imagined it. The Dowager Duchess, Henrika von Eichendorff, a small, fierce old woman with a spine of Toledo steel and eyes that had watched 3 generations lie to her, summoned the whole gathering to the great hall on a grey afternoon, and the ladies assembled in their finest, Cosima Strand, foremost among them, in silver and sapphires, radiant with the certainty of victory, and they waited for the Duke to descend the great stair and name his bride. And a man did descend the stair, but he came not from the ducal apartments above, but through the servants' door below, and he was dressed still in a rough coat, and there was straw yet in his dark hair, and half the room didn't know him, and the other half began to murmur, and Cosima's lovely face began to curdle with confusion, until the old steward stepped forward and struck his staff upon the stone, and named him, and the name fell into the silence, like a stone, into a still pond. His Grace, Constantine, Duke von Eichendorff. The palace was stunned. There is no other word for the sound a great room makes when the thing it believed to be true is revealed as false. It is not a gasp, and it is not a cry, but something between, a sharp collective intake, as of people who have been walking in the dark and find, suddenly, that the floor is not where they thought. Cosima Strand went white, and then red. The ladies who had swept past the stable boy without a glance now searched their memories in horror for what they might have said within his hearing. And Constantine, the Duke in his groom's coat, didn't look at any of them. He crossed the hall, and the crowd parted before him, and he walked the length of it to where a plain young woman in a grey dress stood at the very back, half hidden, the only person in the room who looked not triumphant nor terrified, but merely, quietly, astonished. He stopped before her, and in the ringing silence of that vast, cold hall, he said, in his flat and level voice, that he had come among them as a nobody to learn which of them had a heart, and that he had found only one, and that he would be honored, if she would have him, to make her his wife. And before Annalisa could answer, before she could even draw the breath to answer, he added, more quietly, for her alone though the whole room strained to hear it, that he would not have her think he asked out of pity or out of some cruel jest, that he asked because in 3 days she had shown him more honesty than he had known in 24 years, and that a man who has been lied to all his life will crawl across broken glass toward the first true thing he finds. And I will pause here just a moment before you learn what she answered, to say that if this story has taken hold of you the way the winter took hold of that failing house, you might follow along and subscribe, so that the tales I gather from the cold and quiet corners of the old world find their way back to you, for they are told for listeners like you and no one else. Now, Annalisa looked at the man before her, at the grey eyes she had thought belonged to a groom, and she understood in a rush all the small kindnesses she had given freely to a stranger, and she understood that she had been watched and tested and weighed, and something in her stiffened, for she had a great deal of pride beneath the plain grey wool, and she said plainly that she did not know whether she could love a man who had begun by deceiving her, and a lesser man would have flinched. But Constantine only inclined his head, and said that he did not ask her to love him. He asked only that she consider a partnership, honestly entered, between 2 people who valued truth, and that if love came, it would come as the thaw comes in its own season or not at all, and either way she and her father would want for nothing again. It was a bargain. It was, in its way, as transactional as her father's debts, but it was offered with open hands and no lie in it, and Anneliese, who had never in her life been offered anything without a hook inside it, looked into his weathered, honest face for a long moment, and then she gave him her plain, small hand, and the palace, which had thought itself stunned already, discovered that it had not known the meaning of the word. They were married before the true, deep cold came, quietly, in the old stone chapel of the estate, with the Dowager Duchess as sole witness of any consequence, and Anneliese Falkner became the Duchess von Eichendorff, and passed from the ruin of one house into the splendor of another, and found the second colder than the first. For the Schloss did not warm to her, merely because its master had chosen her. The great households have long memories and longer prides, and the servants who had served the family for generations looked at the plain woman in her plain dress who had come from a bankrupt line, and they did their duty and no more, and behind their smooth faces they judged her and found her wanting, and Anneliese felt the old invisibility close over her again, only now it was a grander and colder invisibility, and it was worse, because now there was a man across the vast dinner table who was meant to be her husband, and who did not know how to speak to her. Constantin, having won her, did not know what to do with her. He had spent his loneliness like a currency for so long that intimacy terrified him more than any battle. He would sit at the far end of the immense table, a distance of some 30 feet of gleaming mahogany and silver candelabra, and address her in short, flat sentences about the weather and the roads, and then fall silent, and the silence would stretch until it filled the whole cavernous room, and Anneliese would sit at her end and eat her supper and understand that she had married a house with no heart. But Anneliese was not a woman who wept at cold rooms. She was a woman who lit fires in them. She had spent her whole life making bleak places bearable, and she set about it now with the quiet method that was her nature. She learned the servants' names, all of them, the scullery maids and the boot boys, and the ancient half-blind man who tended the hall clocks, and she used those names, and she thanked them, and she noticed when the youngest kitchen girl was ill and sent broth, and she asked the old cook about her aching hands and remembered the answer, and slowly, slowly, the way a frozen stream begins to move beneath its ice, the great house began to turn its face toward her. And she found, as she had always found, a neglected space to make her own. Deep in the west wing, behind doors that groaned on their hinges, she discovered the old winter garden, a vast, glass-roofed room that had once been the pride of the estate, and had stood shuttered and dead for years, its great panes grimed to opacity, its beds gone to brown ruin, its famous rose trees, which the dowager told her had been planted by the Duke's grandmother, hacked back and abandoned and half dead in their cold black soil. No one had loved that room in a decade, and Anneliese loved it at once, precisely because no one else did, and she asked her husband, at the far end of the great table one evening, whether she might have it, and he looked at her with faint surprise, and said that she might have anything in the house she wished, in a tone that suggested no one had ever before asked him for anything so small, and so she took the winter garden. She had the panes washed until the grey light poured through them again. She turned the black soil with her own plain hands, the Duchess von Eichendorff on her knees, in the dirt in an old grey dress, to the scandal of the servants, and then, gradually, to their wonder. She saved the roses. She pruned the dead wood, and fed the frozen roots and wrapped the tender canes against the cold, and she spoke to them as she had spoken to the nervous mare, low and steady, and the old cook, watching from a doorway, told the dowager that the new duchess had a way about her that the plants seemed to know. The Dowager Duchess Henrika, who had watched 100 beautiful, useless women pass through her house, and had expected to despise this plain one too, found herself instead going down to the winter garden of an afternoon to sit and watch her grandson's wife work, and to say sharp-cutting things that were, everyone understood, the old woman's particular dialect of love. "You are ruining your hands," the dowager would say. "Yes," Annalisa would answer without looking up. "And your gowns?" "Yes." Henrika von Eichendorff would sniff and settle deeper into her chair and stay another hour. She had not, she reflected, felt so warm in that cold house in 20 years. The first true crack in the ice came over a small thing, as the great things always do. Constantin came home late one bitter evening from a long grey ride into the eastern valley, chilled to the bone and grimmer than usual, for the tenant farms he had gone to see were failing worse than his ledgers had told him, and the people on his land were cold and hungry, and he did not know how to mend it, and the knowledge sat on him like a stone. He expected the vast, dark dining hall, and the 30 feet of table and the silence. He found instead that the great hall had been closed off, and that a fire had been lit in a smaller room he had scarcely entered since boyhood, and that the enormous table had been abandoned in favor of a modest one drawn close to the hearth, set for two, close enough that a man and a woman might speak without shouting, and upon it was a simple hot supper of the sort he had not eaten since he was a child, plain hearty country food, and beside his plate stood a small glass jar in which floated a single early rose, white as frost, the first bloom the resurrected garden had given up. And Annalisa was there, in her grey dress, and she said only that the great hall was too cold for a man come in from the cold, and that she hoped he did not mind the change. He stood in the doorway a long moment. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. And then something moved across his severe face, some small warmth surfacing after a long time submerged, and it was not quite a smile, the almost of a smile, the ghost of the thing itself, and he crossed to the small table, and he sat down close to his wife for the first time in their marriage, and he ate the plain good food, and they talked. They talked of the failing farms, and Annalisa, who had watched her own family's land go to ruin and had learned every hard lesson of scarcity, spoke to him of practical things, of which fields to let lie fallow, and which debts to forgive that they might be repaid in loyalty, of how her own father had lost everything by holding too tightly, and how a hand that grips too hard breaks what it holds. And Constantin listened to her as he had listened to no one in years. And he thought, not for the first time, that his wife possessed a mind he would have crossed a kingdom to consult, and had instead married and hidden at the foot of his table like a fool. The days that followed were warmer. The small room by the hearth became theirs. He began to come home earlier. He began to seek her out in the winter garden, and to sit as his grandmother sat and watch her work, and to speak, haltingly at first and then more freely, of things he had never told a living soul. But there was a shadow still upon him, a locked door in the great house, both literal and otherwise, for Annalisa had noticed, in her quiet, observing way, that there was a wing of the Schloss to which she was never taken, from which the servants emerged with covered trays and lowered eyes, and behind whose doors, once or twice in the deep of the night, she thought she had heard the thin, high sound of a child's voice. She did not ask. She had learned patience the way other women learn embroidery, but she watched her husband's face grow shuttered whenever his steps carried him near that wing, and she saw the weight he bore, and she waited. And one grey afternoon in the winter garden, the wait ended. Constantin came to find her among the roses, with a look upon his face she had not seen before, a look of a man walking toward a cliff. And he sat, and he was silent a long while, and then he said that there was a thing he must show her, a thing that was the true reason he had needed a wife who valued substance over spectacle, the reason he could never have married a Cosima Stratton, though the whole world had pushed him toward her, and that he ought to have shown her long ago, and that he had been afraid. And he rose, and he held out his hand to her, his weathered hand that she had once taken in a stunned great hall, and he led her out of the warm garden and through the cold halls to the locked wing, and he took a key from around his own neck where it had hung all this time against his heart, and he opened the door. Beyond the door was a bright, warm nursery, the warmest room in all that cold house, and in it, among books and toys and a great sleeping cat, sat a small girl of perhaps 7 years, and when she turned her face toward the opening door, Annalisa saw that one side of it was scarred, drawn and silvered and cruel, the mark of an old and terrible burn that ran from her temple to her jaw. This was Pia. She was the Duke's sister, born late to his mother, who had died in the bearing of her, and when Pia was 3, there had been a fire in the East Tower, and a nurse had carried the child out through the flames and saved her life at the cost of half her sweet face, and the great world, which prizes appearance above all things and forgives ugliness in nothing, had recoiled. There had been whispers of a curse upon the house. There had been mothers who would not let the girl near their children. There had been, worst of all, a distant relation, an ambitious man, who had put it about that the disfigured child was feeble in her mind, as well as her face, and unfit to bear the family name, the better to advance his own claim upon the estate. And Constantine, then newly come into his title and grief-stricken and young, had made a terrible protective choice. He had withdrawn Pia from the world entirely, had hidden her in the warm, bright nursery behind the locked door, had let the whisper spread that the child was too frail to be seen, and had thereby kept her safe and kept her caged both at once, and had carried the guilt of it like a stone in his chest ever since. For Pia was not feeble in the smallest degree. She was quick and bright and hungry for the world, and she pressed her small scarred face to the nursery window and watched the horses in the yard and asked questions no one had time to answer, and she was lonely with a loneliness that had shaped her brother's whole soul, for he could not look at her without knowing that he had chosen her safety over her life. And it was this exactly, that had made him despise the beautiful shallow women of his world, for he had known with certainty that not one of them would have looked upon his sister's face with anything but horror, and he could not, would not, bring into his house a wife who would make his sister feel for one instant that she was a thing to be hidden. That was the burden. That was the whole of it, laid bare at last in a warm, bright room. And Annalisa heard it all, standing very still, and when he had finished, she did not speak to him at all. She crossed the room instead, and she knelt down before the small, scarred girl so that their faces were level, and she looked at Pia with her steady, honest eyes. And she did not flinch, and she did not exclaim, and she did not do the terrible kind thing of pretending not to see. She looked, and she smiled her small, true smile, and she said that she had heard there was a young lady in this house who knew a great deal about horses, and that she herself had recently made friends with a very nervous little mare in the stables who was badly in want of visitors, and that she wondered whether Pia might consent, some fine morning, to come and be introduced. And the child stared at her. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, and then Pia's whole ruined, lovely face opened like a rose in the sun, and she said yes. Oh yes. And she seized Annalise's plain hand in both her small ones, and behind them in the doorway, the Duke von Eichendorff, who did not weep, who had not wept since he was a boy, turned his face away and pressed his hand to his eyes, and wept. After that, the thaw was not a slow, creeping thing, but a flood. Pia came out of her locked wing. Annalise took her by the hand and walked her down to the stables in the grey morning light, and lifted her up to lay her small palm against the neck of the nervous mare. And the two nervous creatures, the frightened horse and the hidden child, seemed to recognize something in one another, and Pia laughed, a sound that had not been heard in the open air of that house in 4 years, and the old grooms stopped their work to listen. She came into the winter garden and learned the names of the roses. She came to the small warm supper table by the hearth, and there were 3 places set now instead of 2, and Constantin watched his sister and his wife bent together over a book in the firelight, and understood that the house that had never had a heart had grown one while he was not looking, and that it was beating, and that it was his. And in the growing warmth of it, the last wall inside him came down. He told Annalise things he had never told anyone. She told him of her father, and of the grey dress, and of the peace she had made with being unseen, and he took her plain-scarred, garden-worn hand across the small table and said, in his flat, quiet way, that she had learned to read as other men's shouting, that she was the most seen person in the whole of his world, that he had looked at her more closely than he had ever looked at anything, and that she was not, he said. And here his voice caught, not what he had expected. He had expected, when his grandmother forced the gathering upon him, to endure it. He had expected schemers and had armoured himself against them. He had expected to hire a wife the way one hires a steward, a transaction, a management of the estate of his loneliness. And instead, he had found her, on an upturned pail in his stable, wishing a nobody a good morning. And she had walked into the frozen ruin of him and turned the black soil over with her bare hands, and saved the roots he had thought long dead. And Annalise, who did not spend her tears, felt them rise for the first time in years and didn't fight them, and she said that the thaw had come after all, in its own season, as he had promised her it might, and that she found she loved him, plainly and without reservation, not the Duke and not his fortune, but the tired, honest man in the groom's coat who had wept in a nursery doorway. And so the bargain, honestly entered, became at last the true marriage it had never legally lacked, a partnership of equals, built not on spectacle, but on shared work and shared truth, on turned soil and saved roses, and a small girl's laughter in the stable-yard. And it was, though the world beyond the mountains did not yet know it, unbreakable. But the world beyond the mountains was coming. For a great house cannot keep its warmth a secret forever, and word had begun to travel that the reclusive Duke von Eichendorff had married a nobody and been transformed, that the cold Schloss had opened its shutters, and there were those in the wide, glittering world who heard this news, not with gladness, but with a private, curdling rage. And chief among them, nursing her humiliation like a wound that would not close, was Cosima Strand. Cosima had not forgotten. A beauty scorned in front of the whole assembled nobility of the province does not forget. She polishes the memory of it in the dark until it is sharp enough to cut, and Cosima had spent the long, cold months since her humiliation in the great hall, gathering to herself every scrap of poison she could find, and she had found, at last, the thing she believed would destroy the grey mouse who had stolen her duke. She learned, through a bribed and dismissed servant, of the child in the locked wing. And she twisted it, as her kind always twist the truth, into a blade. When the Dowager Duchess, in her stubborn pride, at last threw open the great house for a spring ball, to present the new Duchess to the world and to silence the whispers, Cosima Strand came. She came uninvited and unstoppable in a gown of blood-red silk, and she waited until the vast ballroom was full of every noble family for 50 miles, until the candles blazed and the music swelled, and Annalisa stood beside her husband in a gown of soft grey that she had chosen herself, because grey was the colour of who she was, and she would not pretend otherwise. And then, in a lull, in a moment engineered for maximum ruin, Cosima raised her crystal voice and asked, sweetly, whether it was true, what everyone was saying, that the Duke kept a monstrous idiot child locked away in the West Wing, a creature so hideous it could not be shown, and whether the new Duchess had known, when she schemed her way into this marriage, that she was binding herself to a cursed and blighted line, or whether she had simply wanted the money badly enough not to care. The music stopped. The whole glittering room turned, and Cosima, radiant with malice, pressed on, her voice rising, painting Annalise for the assembled nobility as exactly the thing Cosima herself was, a fortune hunter, a schemer, a plain, grasping nobody who had trapped a grieving man and covered up his shameful secret to secure her comfort, and she demanded, to the horror and delicious appetite of the crowd, that the Duke produce this hidden monster or admit the shame of his house. It was a masterpiece of cruelty. It was calculated to leave no answer that did not ruin them. To produce the child was to expose Pia to the horror of 1,000 cold eyes, and to refuse was to confirm the slander. And in the ringing silence, Annalisa felt the old cold invisibility reach for her, the whole weight of the glittering world's contempt bearing down, and she felt her husband go rigid beside her, with a fury so absolute it could not find words. But before either of them could speak, another voice cut through the hall, small and clear and utterly unafraid, and every head turned, and there in the great doorway, having slipped from her nursery, and down the long halls all alone, stood Pia. She was 7 years old, and half her face was scarred, and she wore her best dress, and she had heard, in the way children always hear the things adults believe are hidden from them, that a beautiful lady downstairs was saying cruel things about her family, and she had come, trembling and resolute, to see. And she looked at the sea of staring faces, and for one terrible moment the old fear rose in her. And then she found the one face she was looking for, and she walked, small and steady, the whole length of that vast staring ballroom, straight to Annalisa, and she took the Duchess's plain hand in both of hers, as she had that first day in the nursery, and she turned to face the crowd that had come to gawp at a monster. And she was not a monster. She was only a little girl, and the cruelty in the room curdled all at once into shame. And then the Duke von Eichendorff began to speak, and he did not shout, for the men who have the most power have the least need to raise their voices. And the whole vast room went silent to hear him, and what he said was not a defence, but a naming, a slow and rising and unstoppable naming of every truth that cruelty had tried to bury. This, he said, taking his sister's small, scarred hand in his, is Pia von Eichendorff, my sister, whom I love, and who is worth more than every soul in this room save one. And I hid her, he said, and the shame of that is mine and not hers, for I was young and frightened, and I believed the world was as cruel as this lady has tonight proved it to be, and I was wrong to hide her, and I will never hide her again. And then he turned, and he looked at his wife, and he began to name her, one truth at a time, the way the blueprint of his own heart had written it. "This woman," he said, "whom you have been invited to despise, came to my house in a grey dress with nothing, and she was the only person among 100 who treated a stable groom, who was myself, as a human being deserving of courtesy. She did not know I was the Duke. She had nothing to gain, and she was kind anyway, which is the only kindness that means anything at all. She turned the soil of my dead garden with her own hands. She learned the name of every servant in a house that never learned hers. She knelt down before my sister's scarred face without flinching, and offered her friendship when the whole world offered only horror, and she gave this child her life back, and she gave me mine. She has never once wept for herself," he said, "though God knows she has had cause, and she has never once asked me for anything, and she wears grey by choice because she will not pretend to be other than she is, and if that is what this glittering room calls a schemer and a nobody, then I say the words are broken, and I will have new ones. She is the truest heart I have ever known, and I did not choose her. I only had the great good fortune to recognize her when she walked into my stable, and I would marry her again tomorrow in front of all of you, and count myself the luckiest man in the empire." And then, only then, did he turn at last to Cosima Strand, and his voice, which had been warm, went cold as the deep of winter. "As for you," he said, "I know precisely who you are, for I stood in a groom's coat in my own gallery, and heard you say, in your own voice, that you would strip this estate and be rid of every reminder of the contest, and that you would enjoy watching the grey mouse crawl home to her debtors. Those were your words. I can hire 50 like you, you told your friends that night, meaning the servants you struck and scorned. And I say to you now that I would not have one of you, not 50, not 5,000, for all the beauty in the world weighs nothing against the smallest true kindness, and you have never in your life performed one. Leave my house." And the silence broke, not into scandal, but into something Cosima had not foreseen and could not survive, a low murmur of assent, of turned shoulders, of a whole society realigning itself in an instant around the truth it had been shown, and the beautiful woman in blood-red silk found every face closing against her, and she understood that she had not exposed the Duchess at all. She had exposed only herself, and she gathered the shreds of her ruined triumph, and she fled the ball and the province. And in the end, the whole story, defeated not by cruelty, answered with cruelty, but by a truth she had no armor against, pitied at last more than she was hated, which is the worst fate of all for a woman who wished above everything to be envied. And Annalisa stood in the center of the great warm ballroom, with a child's hand in one of hers, and her husband's hand in the other, seen at last, seen entirely, by the whole of the glittering world, and she didn't weep even then, but she smiled her small, true smile, the almost that had become, over the long thaw of that winter, the whole thing itself. The ball did not end that night so much as transform, for once the poison had been driven from the room, the warmth rushed in to fill the space it left, and the noble families who had come to gawp at a monster stayed instead to dance in a house that had, against all expectation, learned how to be happy. And in the years that followed, the story of the Duke and his grey Duchess travelled far beyond the mountains, and it did not travel as scandal, but as something rarer, a thing people told their children when they wished to explain that the worth of a person is not written on their face, nor counted in their coin. The winter garden bloomed. The roses the dowager's own hand had planted came back thicker and wilder than they had ever grown, and Pia grew up among them, unhidden and unafraid, and she rode the nervous mare across the eastern valleys where the tenant farms, forgiven their crushing debts, grew green and grateful again. The Baron Faulkner lived out his days warm at last, and wanted for nothing, and saw his daughter not saved by a marriage, but made whole by a love. And Annalisa, who had once made a quiet peace with being unseen, learned instead the harder and better lesson, that to be truly seen by even one honest heart is worth more than the adoration of 1,000 cold ones. She never did stop wearing grey, but it was no longer the grey of a woman who expected nothing. It was the grey of a woman who had nothing left to prove, and it became, in that valley, the most beloved colour in the world. And if you have stayed with me all this way, to the last turned page of this old, cold tale, then I hope you carry from it the one small truth that undid a palace, that kindness offered where there is nothing to gain is the only wealth that cannot be stolen. Stay a while longer in these quiet corners of the old world with me. Subscribe, and let the next tale find you when the cold comes calling.